What's up, fam? It's your boy, Absalom. So the one and only King David. Yeah, that David, the harpist, giant slayer, beloved of God, all that nonsense. But honestly, I'm here to chat for a good reason. I think it's time Israel got an upgrade to its king. Someone with, style. Someone people want. Someone like, me. Right? My dad's still kind of the shepherd thing, while the rest of us are out here in the palace like, bro, you got a kingdom to run. What are you doing? It's outrageous. Look, he's a legend, sure. But let's get real. The people here deserve a king who's more hands-on. And let's face it, handsome too. Messy? No. Just necessary. Samuel, people. 2 Samuel. Look it up. While Dad's been busy writing Psalms, I've been out here connecting with people, listening to their problems. I mean, would you rather have a guy playing a harp or a guy who's here with the people in chariots and, vision? Thank you. I mean, I only cut this glorious mane about once a year. It's practically a national event, right? Some say my hair weighs as much Dad's crown. Well, I think it means that I'm more used to the weight. Well, let's just say, things are in motion. I'm meeting the people, listening, and getting ready. A kingdom makeover is coming. And when it's official, yours truly is going to be the king this nation deserves. No more hiding out in caves. No more writing psalms. Just action. And let's just say, Dad's had his time. It's my turn. To all my loyal followers out there, stay tuned. Big changes ahead. Hashtag Team Absalom.
So listen, let me tell you a little story. So when I was younger, I worked for Coca-Cola, and Darlene, horrible job. Any Coca-Cola people here? All right, no, okay, yeah, you work for them? You know how horrible it is, right? Maybe it's just where I was. I worked a lot of hours. But Darlene and I were actually the youth ministers at our church back home in, this is really our home, but back in Merritt Island, East Coast Christian Center. And I was working full time, and normally I would work between 45 and 60 hours a week, depending upon the week, what week it was of the month. And in the youth ministry, we'd have youth service on Sunday nights, and we were running about 100 kids. Now, at this point, I'd only been a Christian about a year and a half, but the thing about when I became a Christ follower, I was hungry. I was hungry for the things of God, and I felt called. I really felt a call to serve. I felt a call I started volunteering with the youth ministry, and pretty soon they had me in charge of the youth ministry. And so when that happened, I really wanted to be in full-time ministry. Now, we did an event during that time one weekend, and we had rented a facility in Cocoa, Florida. It's like where the minor league baseball teams play. We rented that facility, did a big youth event. And at the end of the weekend, we had a concert with this band called AWOL, At the Will of the Lord. And if anybody remember Paul Peters when he used to work here? It was his band. So he was like a little teenager. And, just think, I'm trying to describe, what was that band that had Stryper? Just think Stryper. Anybody remember the Christian days? Stryper with the big hair. I mean, he had the big hair anyway. And so we did this concert. And at this concert, because we had a couple hundred teenagers there because we had partnered with another youth ministry, I had some parents come up to me, and they were like, the church should really hire you full time. I mean, I don't understand why you work full-time in a job and then you come pastor these kids. So there's a group of us, we're going to go talk to the pastor about it, and we think that they should hire you. In fact, we're going to try to push him to hire you. And to be honest with you, I was kind of flattered because I wanted to be in ministry, even though at that point, being a young Christian, I am so glad I didn't end up in full-time ministry because the character wasn't there yet. I know because some of y'all are thinking, we don't even see the character now. So I think it would have killed me if I'd have got in ministry that early. Anyway, so I'm all excited. That week, the next week, the pastor calls me and says, hey, can I talk with you after church on Sunday. So I'm like, yeah, baby. Because I'm going in this meeting thinking this is when they're going to offer me a job or something, right? So I'm all excited, and he's asking me these questions, trying to get my take on this whole situation. But you ever been in that position where you go in thinking one thing, but you could kind of sense that it's not going in the direction that you thought it was going to go? That's where this is, because I'm kind of puzzled. I mean, I've done that before. I went in and told another pastor one time about a practical joke that I pulled on one of our employees, and he goes, I could fire you for that. And I was like, I didn't know, because I would not have come and told you about the joke if I thought I could get fired for it. But anyway, it was kind of that thing. I could sense where it's not going that direction, and he finally said to me, he goes, you have no idea what's going on here. I'm like, what? He goes, you are being like an Absalom. He said, you don't know this because you're young, but the spirit in which they're operating in is actually, and take this how you will, is actually a rebellious spirit, and they've swept you up in it. Now, at that point, I'd only been a Christian about a year and a half, and I knew who Absalom was, but I didn't know Absalom. I didn't know who he was. And so then my pastor gives me this book, Tale of Three Kings. And I'm telling you what, when I read it, it completely changed my life. In fact, by the time I read it, I was like, forgive me, Father, I know not what I do, right? Because this book was life-changing because, one, it gave me a view on authority that I'd never had before, because I'm going to just let you in on a secret. By default, I am a rebellious person. You tell me that I can't do something, I'm going to do it. I'm very, if left to my own imagination, I would become an anarchist. I don't get along with HOAs. I don't get along with fish and wildlife. I don't get along with police officers. By the way, I got a ticket in Wyoming. In Wyoming, they have the speed limits. I don't know if you ever been there. They're small towns, and it just drops from 70 to 30. And there's no reduced speed limit ahead. I get that. I've been there plenty of times, so I know. So I'm just doing like 32 through all these towns. And then this one town, there's the speed limit says 30, but up ahead I can see the 70, so I start to speed up. And as I go around a turn, there's a police officer, and he clocked me at 41, about to hit the 70-mile-an-hour thing. Yeah, so you can see why I have a rebellious streak, right? But it was life-changing because not only did it give me another view on authority that I'd never had, that really isn't taught in our culture, but it also gave me a view on brokenness that I'd never seen. Now listen, if you haven't read this book, and I get it, I'm not a reader, Eric, I highly recommend you read the book. And this is the last week we're going to be selling them. And even if you're not a reader, it is an easy read. It is so, look at the pages. Look, see how blank they are? Look, there's tons of them. You can read this book and go like, you'll be at a Christmas party and you'll go, hey, I read a book. And they'll be like, I don't care, but I wanted you to know I read a book, the first one this year. And it's not even New Year's. No, but read it, because I'm telling you, you could finish it in 2.5 hours, except that you'll probably sit and mark things and sit and think about things, so it might take a little bit longer. It is such a great book that it's one of the books that we always try to have every person who comes on staff read this book. I have my children read this book. It's a book that I read every 5 years or so because it's stuff that I need to read all the time or hear about, remind myself. So that's the name of this series, A Tale of Three Kings. Now, Pastor Donnie walked us through our first king, King Saul, who sat in this throne, and he carried this spear. And Donnie talked about this king who was really insecure, and he basically saw the young upstart David as a threat to his kingdom. And so then Saul did everything that he could to eliminate this young upstart David, who... This is a great spear. At the end of the service, I'm going to pick somebody out to throw it at. And then of course, and Donnie did such a great job, but then of course last week, Stephen, he talked to us about David. And David it's very multifaceted David, because of the fact that you have different aspects of David's life. You have David when he was a young shepherd boy. You have David when he killed Goliath. You have David when he became the king. You have David when he was the middle-aged king. And you have the David that we're going to be looking at today, the older king, and how he responded to today's king, Absalom. You saw him. Fabsalom, right? Absalom, who sat in this third chair, and actually he didn't sit here for very long. If you read the story, he is the shortest king that we have. In fact, in this story, there were some others that their lives were shorter, but he was the one. He not only was his time in this chair short, but he was also a self-proclaimed king. Now, Absalom was the son of David, third son of David. And Absalom, when he was young, he moved with his family, with David, from Hebron, which used to be the capital of Israel, to Jerusalem. Now, he spent most of his life in Jerusalem, and I just like to think about it kind of like the royal family. Prestige, I mean, he was a favorite, not only of his father, but he was a favorite of the people. His charming manners, his personal beauty, you saw his video up there, right? His ways, his love of pomp, his royal presence captivated the hearts and the people of Israel. Again, just like, his great style, like a social influencer. He drove a magnificent chariot. He had 50 soldiers run out in front of him when he came into town. And so he was beloved by the kingdom. He was beloved by the people. He was a good-looking man. In fact, here's how 2 Samuel describes him. We're going to start in 2 Samuel chapter 14. And here's how it describes this lovely young man named Absalom. It says, in all of Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his feet, there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut his hair once a year because it became too heavy for him. He would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels by the royal standard. So that's about 5 pounds. So Prince Absalom, he's good looking. He's a popular prince. Again, I compare it to maybe what happens in England where there's this fascination with the royal family. And so he is a young, good looking prince driving the sharp chariot with all the right entourage, right? And he was also a favorite of his father. But in the next chapter, we start to see a different turn. 2 Samuel chapter 15, it starts out, it says, in the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses with 50 men to run ahead of him. And he would get up early, listen to this, and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. And whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out, hey, what town are you from? And he would answer, your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel. So in those days, most of the governmental and civil issues were handled at the city gates. If you read the Bible, anybody in here read the Bible? All right, Proverbs 31, which if you can read a proverb a day every day for a month, so Proverbs 31 would have been No, because yesterday was 30, so you'd skip it. Well, anyway, Proverbs 31 talks about a noble woman. We call it the Proverbs 31 woman. And when it talks about the wife of noble character, one of the characteristics is that her husband is respected at the city gates where he takes his place with the elders, because that's where people came when they needed a decision, a justice, whether it be civil or criminal. They would bring that matter to the city gates, whether this was a small town or a large town. And the elders of the city, that's where they conducted their business. But this was Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the capital. It was the big city. And so Jerusalem is where the big matters ended up. So if you took a matter to your local city and they couldn't handle it, they said, go to Jerusalem. So the city elders, or if you would, the cabinet of David, would sit outside the city gates and they would handle decisions, whether it be civil or criminal decisions. And then only the big ones would actually reach the king. So here's what Absalom would do. Absalom would set himself up a little bit earlier down the road. And when these country bumpkins were on their way to town, and they were easy to recognize because there was actually a lot of scams to try to rip off these guys because they all live in the country, now they're coming to the big city, Absalom would intercept them before they got to the elders, and he'd say, hey, where are you from? That's what's going on. So verse 3, it says, then Absalom would say to this person, look, your claims are valid and proper, but there's no representative of the king to hear you. And then Absalom would add, but if I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or a case would come to me, and I would see that they receive justice. See what's going on here? This is where it begins. This is where it starts. Absalom begins to gather people to himself. If I were the king, you probably won't get any justice if you go there. In fact, I'm not sure there's anybody there that'll even hear your case. But you know, if I was the king, if I was in charge, be a different story. See, and this is how we sometimes think or maybe even talk when we're in a place like Absalom. And like myself, back when my pastor said, you're being like an Absalom, we often don't realize what we're doing. Well, if I was the supervisor, if you worked for me, if I was the pastor, if I was the head doctor, if I was the officer in charge, and see, what we see is Absalom begins to sow doubt into the hearts of people for their current king. Now, it's one thing if you feel that you're called to be a king, or if you're called to be a pastor, you're called to be a leader, you're called to be someone like that, then go for it. But if someone is such a good king, then why do they do it by stealing people from others? And that's exactly what Absalom does, because look at verse 7. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice. Look at this last sentence. And so he stole the hearts of the people. It wasn't given to him, he stole it. Now, whether this was premeditated, like he'd planned to do this, I mean, if he did, it's actually pretty smart. Or maybe it was like me. That flattery is hard to resist, isn't it? You'd make a better pastor than the one we have now. Oh, you'd make a great king. Oh, you would be a better husband than the one she has now. See, this is what rebellion looks like to authority in its early stages. In fact, do you know that most church start this way? Most what we call church plants, new churches start this way. Plans are not because, most churches start not because someone feels called to a city, like that was our case. 20 years ago, we felt called to come back to our hometown. I grew up and was born and raised here, to reach people who are far from God. But do you know most church plants don't happen that way? Most church plants happen when someone in one church in a town, I've seen it in this town, out of relational hurts or offenses, decides to plant a church in the same town, and they do a great job of taking people from the existing church, which, by the way, is not a kingdom principle. All right? So their main, and here's what happens when that church plants. Their main focus isn't on the people that we can reach or what God has called us to do. Their main focus is, this is not who we're going to be like. In other words, if I was the pastor, this is what I do. And so this new church isn't driven by vision. It's actually driven by hurt or by offense. And it's been my experience that most of those churches don't last, because they're started out of the wrong motive. Here's how the author of A Tale of Three Kings puts it. I'm going to read you this. I think it's at page 65. He says, I find it curious that those who feel qualified to split God's kingdom do not feel capable of going somewhere else, to another land, to raise up a completely new kingdom. No, they must steal from another leader. I've never seen the exception. They always seem to need at least a few prepackaged followers. There are many lands unspoiled and unpossessed. There are many people in other places waiting to follow a true king, a true man of God. Why don't would-be kings and prophets simply walk away quietly, alone, then find another people in another place, and there raise up the kingdom they envision? See, that's how a lot of churches start. It's actually how a lot of businesses start as well. And that's the way this rebellion starts that we're looking at today. Now, what we're going to find out about Absalom, which makes him different from his father David, who was the king, is, and they talked a lot about David when he was younger and his response to authority, is that Absalom looked at the weaknesses of his father, the king, and when he looked at the weaknesses of his father, he used it as reasons or justification to not submit to David, because that's what rebellion does. In fact, here's kind of the big idea. Rebellion looks for weaknesses in authority as a reason to not submit. Rebellion, whether it's outright rebellion, or this subtle non-submission, he's not my president, so I'm really not going to. It's not I don't agree with the HOA. Whether it's that, it looks for inconsistencies. Rebellion looks for weaknesses and shortcomings as a reason not to follow or comply or submit. But the question that we come up with is, what were the weaknesses in David? I mean, what were the character flaws in David? Because isn't David called a man after God's own heart, right? So we don't see the lack of character in David like we saw in Saul, right? Because I mean, if anyone, you heard the story, you read the book, if anyone had a right to rebel or to not submit, it'd be David, right? When King Saul's trying to make a shish kebab out of him, and King Saul spends years trying to hunt him down and kill him for no reason. So what would be, excuse me, the weaknesses or the inconsistencies that David had? Let me share a couple of them with you. Number one, I think one of his weaknesses was women. Women weaken legs. That's from Rocky. Remember Rocky? Women. One of them was women, okay? In fact, the first instance that we're going to look at was well before Absalom. Absalom wasn't even born yet. It was some 30 years before Absalom was even born. David was a brand new king. He was a much younger king. I'd say he was actually kind of a middle king, because it says in 2 Samuel that it was a time when when most kings go out to battle, David stayed home. For some reason, he'd raised up enough leaders and generals that he didn't have to go out to fight. And so he was alone back in Jerusalem while his army is fighting somewhere, and he's up on his palace, and while he's up on the roof of his palace, he spies a very beautiful young woman named Bathsheba, or we know her as Take a Bathsheba, because that's what she was doing on the roof of her building. Now that sounds kind of weird, like why would she take a bath? We're not going to be victim blaming here, but if you've ever been to Jerusalem, David's palace was high up over the city, and he could look down because it was downhill, so he could see everything in the city of Jerusalem, and they didn't have modern plumbing and bathrooms, so that's where they would take baths. But he's smitten by her beauty, so he calls her, has some servants go get her, bring him to his palace. Now here's the problem, is she's married to a guy named Uriah, and Uriah is actually on the front lines serving as he's actually listed in one of David's mighty men. I don't know about you, but I think there is nothing lower than when a guy's deployed and someone's hitting on his wife. I hate it. This is what David's doing. In fact, in this little tryst, how do you say it? Tryst? How do you say that word? This little affair, she ends up pregnant. So David brings Uriah back from the front lines to try to get him to sleep with his wife so that he thinks that this baby's hers. Well, he doesn't do it. So then the next night he gets him drunk, because alcohol always works, right, guys? Some of you are baby daddies because of that. Anyway, that doesn't work. And he's finally like, hey, why don't you do this? And here's what he says. He goes, I could not sleep with my wife knowing that my buddies are still in the front lines, which I'm sure a lot of you guys do. When you come home from deployment, you're like, sorry, honey, I still got guys on the front lines. I can't sleep with you. Because you guys are noble, right? Right? Am I right? Okay. Anyway, so that doesn't work. So he does this. He sends Uriah back to the front lines with a sealed letter for his general Joab. And in the letter, he asked Joab to put Uriah on the front lines, and when the fighting gets the fiercest, pull back and leave Uriah by himself. No. Yeah. And Uriah dies. And after a time of mourning, he takes Bathsheba as his wife. So David basically has Uriah essentially carry his own death warrant. So, you know this stuff never stays in secret. He sent servants over to get her. It comes out. Actually, Nathan the prophet comes to him and confronts him and says, hey, let me tell you a little story. There's a man who was really rich, had whole flocks of sheep. And then his next door neighbor was poor, and all he had was one little sheep, and that little sheep was like a pet. Slept with them, they named him, right? So one day the rich man has somebody come visit, and hospitality rules that you provide a meal for someone who visits you. So instead of taking taking a sheep out of his hundreds of flock, he took the man that only had one and killed it and fed it to his guests. And Nathan goes, so what should I do? And it says David burned with anger and said, that man should be killed. And Nathan goes, you're the guy. And so basically confronts him, but David repents. But not because he was convicted or felt guilty. He didn't go to Nathan and go, I've done something wrong. But because he was caught. But he still repents, and even though he repents, and by the way, this repentance is where we get this idea that David was a man after God's own heart. He understood the heart of God, because when he got caught, he wrote this psalm. I'm only going to read you 2 scriptures of it, but the whole psalm is about when he got caught. He says in Psalm 51, you do not delight in sacrifice, or I'd bring it to you. In other words, I've sinned, but I know that you're looking for more than just a burnt offering. You don't take pleasure in burnt offerings. He goes, but my sacrifice, oh God, is a broken spirit. and a broken and contrite heart, God, that you will not despise. So he understood that it wasn't about sacrifices, it was about the heart. I like to say that he knew that God was a God of grace, that David was a New Testament man stuck in an Old Testament body, okay, trapped in an Old Testament body. So even though it was all done in secret, it all came out. It always does, right? So David was forgiven, and he knew that, but there were still consequences for what he did. And the prophet, when he confronts him, tells him what those consequences are. Here's what he says. This is what the Lord says. And this is prophecy. This is foretelling of what's about to happen 30 years from now with Absalom. He says, out of your own house, I'm going to bring calamity before you. And before your eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. That actually happens during this rebellion. I think it's funny that what he did on the roof in secret, not funny, but anyway. He says, you did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all of Israel. Then David said to Nathan, I've sinned against the Lord. And Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You're not going to die, but because by doing this, you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. So there were consequences to David's sin, but David still had a heart after God. Now let's look at the second example of his weaknesses that maybe Absalom capitalized on, okay? The second example happened much later, and it's really what drove Absalom to justify his rebellion and his reasons to rebel. It happened when David's oldest son, his name was Amnon. And Amnon was in love with his half-sister, Tamar. I know, it's the Bible, you should really read this stuff. And so he tricks her and he pretends he's sick and has her come over to prepare food for him. And when he gets her into his chambers, he basically rapes her. And then he's so disgusted afterwards that he just sends her away. Well, first of all, one of the things that happens is David does nothing about this. And this was a crime that was worthy of death. If you read the law, you were to be stoned. And David does nothing about this. And this infuriated Absalom. And so time goes by, he's premeditated, he takes his time, and a couple years later, he murders his own brother, Amnon. Now, Tamar was his full sister, so that was his sister. So he murders Amnon. And that was also a punishment that was worthy of death. But he does it because David wouldn't do anything about it. And he takes matters into his hand, and he does nothing about this one either. After Amnon is murdered by Absalom, David does nothing. Now, Absalom flees for a couple years to another city where his grandfather lived. But here was one of David's weaknesses. David had a weakness at disciplining his own child. Now, if that was you or me and we killed our brother and our father didn't do anything about it, we'd be relieved, right? But how many of you have ever raised a kid or you've seen this situation where I'm not getting the parents' attention, so I'm going to misbehave even more, right, Donnie? I'm going to misbehave even more to get look, you're not going to pay attention to me, and that's basically what Absalom does. Absalom challenges David by doing something that he knows he should be put to death. In fact, he says it this way. He says, if I'm guilty of anything, let David put me to death. So this whole thing brings us to the point where Absalom would stand by the road leading to the gates of Jerusalem, looking for the forgotten, the disenfranchised, the disillusioned, the ostracized, and begins to gather them to himself. And he does this for 4 years. And finally, with great fanfare, in Hebron, which used to be the capital of Jerusalem, he has thousands of troops now, and he has all these people gathered to him, and with great fanfare, even a high priest, they blow the trumpet and they declare that now Absalom is the king of Israel. And he launches an attack against Jerusalem and David. David, who never lost a battle. David, who was a man of war, so much so, Stephen talked about this last week, that he wasn't allowed to build the temple for God because there was too much blood on his hands. But David refused to fight. Just like when he was younger, and he refused to lift a hand towards the anointed king, Saul. He refused to fight. Just the way he refused to take the kingdom that way, he refused to keep the kingdom that way. In fact, his reasoning was, if God gave me the kingdom and I didn't lift a hand towards it, but God gave me the kingdom out of Saul's hand and he did it, not me, maybe he's replacing me with a new king. In fact, here's how he puts it in the book I think it's page 72. He says it's better, because he won't fight his son. He says, in fact, they flee Jerusalem. And when they flee, his son takes over the palace, and that's when he has sex with those 10 concubines on the roof for everyone to see. The prophecy come true 30 years ago. It's better that I be defeated, even killed, than to learn the ways of a Saul or the way of an Absalom. The kingdom is not that valuable. Let him have it. If that be the Lord's will, I repeat, I shall not learn the ways of either Saul or Absalom. So David flees with his men that are loyal to him, because much of the military went over to Absalom. David flees, but his men end up meeting Absalom. And even though David had given strict orders, do not harm the boy, Joab, who was kind of a loose cannon for David, and the reason why I believe he was a loose cannon was because he's the one that had the dirt on David. He's the one that got the note, said put Uriah on the front lines. He saw David marry Uriah's widow. So he could kind of do whatever he wanted because, hey, I got the dirt on you. So he disobeys David's orders and he kills Absalom. And Absalom, who sits on this throne, I don't know how long it was, maybe a day, maybe a week, he's dead. Now, what led to the point of Absalom raising his hands against his own father? Again, I say he found weakness in authority and justified his own rebellion. Now, here's the problem. Everybody has weaknesses. Everybody has shortcomings. Everybody has flaws. Everybody makes mistakes. Everyone has faults. Even the best king. Even the best pastor, even the best spouse, the best boss, the best president, they all have weaknesses. But David and Saul, look, Saul definitely had weaknesses, but David never rebelled. Even when he would have been justified, even when his own men justified it. God has delivered Saul in your hand. And we can use weaknesses or flaws in authority to justify not submitting. But when we do that, we are in danger of becoming an Absalom or a Saul. Now, here's one of the problems. Nobody wants to sit on this throne, right? No one wants to be an Absalom. Nobody wants to sit here. Most people want to sit in this seat, right? We want to be a David. We like to think that we're a David. We like to think that we're not threatened by the young upstarts, and I'm not motivated by rebellion. Well, so here's the problem, is that when you sit here, Absaloms only see Sauls. When you're an Absalom, your view of everyone is a Saul. When you're an Absalom, you view everyone, even if that someone you're viewing is like a David who had a heart after God. But Absalom saw David like he was a Saul, like David had a spear and was trying to kill him. That's how, and when you're an Absalom, you see everyone as a Saul. And when you're a Saul, you see everyone as an Absalom. No matter what their hearts are. Because remember, again, David, whose heart is after God. Saul saw him as an Absalom. Saul saw him in rebellion. So when you're in that position that David was in, and you're serving a Saul that throws spears at you, you know, that when you're working for that boss that seems to have it out for you, or that coach that seems to want to hurt you, or someone's threatened by your talents, the question that you have to ask yourself is this. That guy who seems to have it out for me, my boss, that commanding officer, whatever it is, are they a Saul that's out to get me? Or am I an Absalom that sees everybody as a Saul? So how do you know if the person that is trying to get you, the person that's out to get you, is really a Saul? You don't. What if he's a David and you're rebelling because you're an Absalom? And when you're a boss or a supervisor or an officer or a senior pastor, and you have a junior associate or a deckhand or an assistant coach or a junior officer that is so talented, and everybody talks about how talented they are, and everybody talks about, oh, they've killed their tens of thousands. The question you have to ask yourself is, are they really trying to overthrow me? Do they really want my job? Or am I a Saul that sees everyone as an Absalom? Now, how do you know if that person that you feel like wants your job is really an Absalom? Or are you a Saul that sees everybody that's talented as an Absalom? Here's a problem, is those questions can only be answered by time and by history. But in the meantime, you have to ask yourself a question, and that is, where's your heart? Is your heart a heart after God, like David? And like David, who basically looked at everyone in authority as someone from God. Until God changes that person is an authority, and I have to believe, again, a New Testament guy in an Old Testament body. He knew what Apostle Paul said in Romans, that all authority is from God. In fact, I remember talking years ago, there was a church in Cocoa, and because the youth pastors, we kind of had a Church of Destin thing going on, so we did stuff together. And I remember there was this church that basically chewed up and spit out youth pastors on a yearly basis. And I remember one of the young youth pastors, we were at a prayer thing, and we used to pray once a week together in the mornings, and him and I were the only ones that showed up that morning, and he basically broke down. And he just told me about this description of his pastor that was like a Saul, that everything he did was, he just felt threatened. And I remember what this book said. This book said, I paraphrase it, but here's what this book said. It says that God uses the outside Sauls to kill the Sauls that are inside of us. Let's say that again. Because you might be in a situation like that. You might have a boss like that, a coach like that, a commanding officer like that, whatever, a senior pastor that's like that. Seems like he has it out for me. And then when someone says, oh, you did good, he's always telling me what I did wrong. Sometimes God allows us to be in situations like that where we are under Sauls who throw spears at us in order to kill the inside Saul that wants to pick up that spear and throw it back. So sometimes God puts you in situations for you to have an outside Saul so that God can kill that inside Saul, that inside of you that wants to pick up that spear, whether it's in our mind. We think about the situations, I would take him out fishing and push him off the boat, or whether it's on social media, or whether it's a real spear and throw it back. To do that only ensures that we become Sauls ourselves. Now, listen, no one wants to go through those situations. But to not go through them is to shortcut the work of God that he wants to do in you. I mean, think about it. The 7 years that David ran, the 7 years that David was on the run, running for Saul, were probably the worst time of his life. But the work of brokenness that God did during that time was invaluable. Now, I'm not saying you have to stay in an abusive situation. I'm not saying that. David did not. He ran. But when he had a chance to take out Saul, he didn't do it because he decided to never come against someone who was in authority. And all those 7 years of running and hiding, that is what God used to kill the Saul that was inside him. Now, I got to wrap this up, so I want to speak to two different groups here. When my pastor gave me this book, I learned that I was unknowingly following in the ranks of an Absalom. And I changed. I vowed to see authority differently. I vowed to see the way God sees authority. Because when we see as God sees, we're more inclined to do as God says. And we went through a rough time. I talked about my pastor was found in sin. I talked about this a couple of months ago. And the church basically went through a split. And for that 5 years, that was my time in the cave. I did not want to be in ministry, but there was a time of brokenness that came in that time that was invaluable. I never want to do it again. But it was developed through adversity. Now, David's heart was probably developed at an early age because some scholars believe that he was illegitimate. Because think about this. If you know the story, Samuel goes to Jesse and says, we're looking for a new king. Have all your sons here for a barbecue tomorrow. And then he goes there the next day and he says that none of those 7 sons, he says, do you got any more? And what does Jesse, his father, say? Oh yeah, there's David. He's out back in the field. In Psalm 51, it says, that psalm that I read to you, part of it, he says that I was conceived in iniquity. So scholars believe that maybe he was the half-brother and a half-son or a full son, but he had another mother. That's why he wasn't considered with the 7. When David had to take supplies to the front lines when his brothers were there where Goliath was, you know what they'd say to him? Oh, you proud, you insolent fool. And you know he was redheaded. Not many redheads in Israel. It's kind of a Mediterranean look. So maybe David's brokenness happened early on. Maybe David's brokenness came because he wasn't one of the regular family, right? But he started out his life broken. Or it could be like me. It's never too late to become a David. It's never too late to begin to recognize, because here's the issue. If you think there's no way that you could ever be an Absalom, you're probably an Absalom. But to endure those difficult times of brokenness is to ensure that you're a David and that you have a broken spirit and a contrite heart. In fact, Jesus said it this way: you're either going to be broken on the rock, Jesus, or be broken by the rock. So if you're going to be broken, choose which way it's going to be. So for you younger people, let me talk to you. You're younger people. If you're in one of those situations, let me just encourage you. Maybe getting out of it isn't the case. Maybe God is using that situation to kill the inside Saul, and he's using an outside Saul. Now, second, I want to talk to you, those of you who are older. And I mean older my age, okay? We can't be threatened by Davids around us. Because I often think about this. Think about this. What if Saul would have embraced David? Because you know when Saul said, whoever kills Goliath doesn't have to pay taxes, and they get my oldest daughter. You're 17 years old. Do you care about taxes? No. But a girl? Yeah. So he promised his oldest daughter to the one who killed Goliath. But instead of giving her his oldest daughter, he gave his second daughter, Micah, who was barren. So she bore no kids to David. If Saul would have given David his oldest daughter, then he would have had grandchildren. And someone from his line would have been on the throne forever, because that was the promise that David had from the prophet, was that you're going to be king and someone will sit on your throne forever, which was alluding to Jesus. If Saul would have embraced his talents at his old age, he could have retired as an elder statesman, playing with his grandkids while his son-in-law ran the kingdom, and his son-in-law would have definitely honored him. But instead, Saul lost it all because of his own insecurities. Now, because I learned to be like a David, I hope, because it's really hard to see an Absalom in our own life in the mirror. I've never really been threatened by people who work for me who are more talented than me. I mean, look around here. Look at this church. Look at the creativity. You know what? This church is what it is because of the creative people around me, the talented people around me. I hear it all the time. I hear, oh, they've killed their 10,000s. In fact, while I was gone, I got texts every week. Oh my gosh, John Henry killed it. Whitney was great. Oh, you should have seen Jessica. You would have been so proud of her. Donnie knocked it out of the park. Stephen, I got him all week. And you know what? I wasn't threatened. I was excited. In fact, that's my dream. That one day, when this church, someone who's more talented than me, takes over this church, and I'll know when we get there, when people come and go, Eric, nothing personal, we really love you, but we love. See, I love that. And instead of throwing spears, I want to celebrate them. So I can get old and watch as this church as the leaders in this church take this into the next stage of life. And that's our rally cry. Our rally cry, you know, has been in the heart to reach in the race to reach the hearts of the next generation. The ones who get there win. And this is how we get there, by embracing the heart of David. See, Paul said, you've got a lot of teachers, but you don't have many fathers. We have a generation that's looking for fathers. In fact, your generation, the generation of your kids, Annabelle, they're the generation that is going to usher in a revival because we've got a generation that is looking for authenticity. They're looking for truth. They're looking for, because they've been given all this stuff that says it's true and it's not. And if we will have the heart of David, because, you know, coincidentally, the last statement in the Old Testament, the very last statement, in the last chapter of the last book of the Old Testament, promises that in the last days, God is going to turn the hearts of the fathers back to their children, and he's going to turn the hearts of the children back to their fathers. Can you imagine? And I know I went a long time, but I've been away for 5 weeks. Can you imagine a church full of Davids, young ones like Annabelle and Louie? I'm just pointing them out, those kids that are Davids, and then a church full of older Davids who are not afraid of the new ones, that are not afraid of the champions, that are not afraid of those that are more talented than them. There is nothing that God can't do with a church like that. Let's pray. Fathers, forgive us. I prayed that when I read that book, forgive me for I know not what I do. I know there's probably some people in here when we read a book like this or we hear a message like this, we think that's me. And I didn't realize that I was following in the ways of Absalom, or I didn't realize that I was following in the ways of Saul. But God, we know it's not too late to have a heart after you. We know it's not too late to follow in the ranks of David. Lord, those hard times, that we would endure those hard times. The book of James says that when we do that, we learn patience, and patience brings perseverance, that we would be perfect, lacking in nothing. God, I pray that as a church, you would build a church that is full of Davids, young Davids, Davids who dare to believe God, who can step out and take chances and take risks, and that you also have a church of old Davids that are ready to usher in the next generation. Lord, we love you so much. We thank you for what you're doing. In Jesus' name, amen.